This is one of my favorite games. It shows the vulnerability of the f7 square throughout the game and has a nice speculative sacrifice. We start out with the Spanish game, and Black, a strong master in the Bay Area, chooses the standard move a6. After the retreat and knight f6, I decided not to play the normal move, castling, but instead I choose a rare line known as the whorl attack. This is a very simple strategy for white in the Spanish game. The idea is simply to castle and then slide a rook to d1, after which the d-file can be opened and the black queen can find herself vulnerable to attack. Grandmaster Sergei Tivyakov is the current leader of the whorl attack at top professional levels. Black chases back the bishop and brings his own bishop to c5, a nice active square that controls d4, and at least puts a little pressure at f2. I decide to play for the central plan. I'm going to castle, put the rook on d1, and then play d4. Black plays the standard move d6. And now I overreact a little bit. I don't want Black's bishop coming to g4, so I played h3. But this isn't necessary because Black's bishop is headed to b7 anyway. Now the rook gets into position at d1. Black centralizes a rook, but notice that this takes some defense away from the key square f7. I don't do anything with that yet, but decide to work on the queen side. I challenge the pawn at b5, and my opponent pushes to b4. Now I secure some space on the queen side by advancing the pawn to a5, and Arne decided to play on the queen side, putting the queen on b8, and this is a mistake. The queen really should have gone to e7 and stayed around the center. So I make a little sacrifice. I'm willing to offer up the pawn at e4 after the e-file opens in order to have a strong pawn at d4 and control key central territory. After the capture and recapture, I was expecting the pawn to be grabbed with rook takes e4. This was certainly playable, but I think I could get a good game by bringing my bishop out and then the knight out, developing quickly, and now aiming a little bit at h7. I would have been happy with this position. A pawn down, there may not be full compensation, but as a practical matter, white has lots of chances. My opponent felt the same way and retreated the bishop to a7. Now I make a advance in the center. I'm not really threatening the knight because my pawn is pinned by the rook at e8, but this creates some difficult problems for Black. For example, if the knight retreated, then I could have gotten a strong attack with knight g5. Of course, Black could capture the pawn and then open up the line for the bishop, but again I have an attack and I'm threatening to play rook takes d8, removing the defender of f7, and then bishop takes f7 check. Another defense would be to bring the rook to e7, but then I could pin the knight and threaten to smash open the king side. So my opponent decided to secure the e4 square by playing d5. I put my queen in position, and now Black has to aim for some complications, because a simple move here like knight d7 would be met by bishop takes d5, and then I could just slide the bishop back with a very good game. So instead, after queen d3, the knight, which is now threatened because there's no more pin, goes to e4. This gives up the pawn at d5, but black doesn't mind because the whole idea was to go after my f2 square. And remember that f2 and f7 are the key squares, not just in the opening, but often in the middle game. This sacrifice was not unexpected. I could, of course, capture the knight. It's not clear that black would have enough compensation, but I prefer to attack, and since the f7 square is available, I go after it. This is a speculative sacrifice. I couldn't work out all the details, but I just felt that it was worthwhile. Now, before we look at the sacrificial line for white, let's see what would have happened if I captured. Then, since the pawn at d4 is pinned, the pawn could be captured. I could renew the attack at f7 after the exchange. Another exchange leaves my king a little bit vulnerable after c5. Now, because black's rook is stuck at a8, I really don't think that this would have been a bad way for me to play. I would be up a piece for a pawn, but at the same time, I just preferred to go on the offensive, and I figured that my sacrifice at f7 was going to lead to victory. The queen moves in, and then h7 is targeted as well as f7. Now my rook at d1 is now sacrificed. I've already given up a bishop, and here goes the rook. In retrospect, probably black should have gone for the sacrifice knight takes h3 check, because after I take, my d-pawn falls. I can sacrifice for it and then continue on the attack. And this also looks pretty good for white, but it's not nearly as bad as knight takes d1, because now I take the pawn with check, force the king out. The king can't go to f7, so I'm going to win the g-pawn. Now the king has to retreat. I give a check, and let's pause for a moment here. We can see that I have a variety of discovered checks available with my knight, but none of those checks actually lead to anything concrete. They may look good at first, but remember, I've sacrificed a rook and a bishop for just 3 pawns, so even if I can conspire to win something back, black may still have a large material advantage. Instead, I offer up another pawn to draw the king out further. Now, if the king retreats to c8, I would be able to sacrifice the knight, and then whatever happens, my queen goes to d7, checkmate. For example, if captures, checkmate. So, the king must come up, and now I force the king further up the board. King comes to d5. I check from behind, and now the king's all the way up at c4, where I can bring my knight out with check. But the king is still hard to hunt down, because remember that my pawn at d4 is threatened with check, and the only check that I have that's of any use now is to bring my queen to f5. I've got to continue the attack somehow because I'm down so much material. Now black takes the pawn with the king, and suddenly I realize that my attack is going to end if he can move the king with check, because the bishop at a7 aims at my king. Fortunately, after knight comes to f3 and checks the king again, and the king moves up, I have a wonderful move that ends the game. I don't have any great discovered checks with my knight right now, because if I move my knight black king will advance to e2 and I will be in check, and then the initiative goes over to black. However, I can prevent that with a quiet move, moving the king to f1. Now that option isn't available for the black king, and notice that the black king has no place to go, so I'm threatening knight to c4. My opponent resigned, and quite rightfully so. This game is a great example of play against f2 and f7 in the early middle game.